You're listening to the Leadership Blend Podcast.
I'm ready.
On the Thinking Out Loud Network. Check out the Thinking Out Loud Network at thinkingoutloudnetwork.com.
All right, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of the Leadership Blend with your host, Ricardo D. Rice. And I'm going to throw shade. I get it because it's my show. I get to throw shade. So my homegirl's back after what, 3 weeks?
It's been about 3 weeks.
Like 3 weeks. She abandoned me, and she's finally back. So I'm going to let her introduce herself for those that can't see it.
My name is Simone Cherie. I'm the state campaign organizer for the Reform Alliance, and I was in the middle of a lot, and it was holiday time, and so I took a few weeks off, but it's good to be back.
Well, it's nice to be able to take a few weeks off. I couldn't take a few weeks off, so you saying that doesn't mean much to me, but okay. Well, we're so happy to have Simone back. Everybody knows that this is the girl, the politics girl. That's the first time I heard her use her official title because I just saw her today, so I didn't get a chance to catch up and find out what she does. So what exactly does that mean? What do you do?
I focus on criminal justice reform, mostly probation and parole, post-incarceration, reentry efforts. So not necessarily too much legislation this year, but when we do have a couple of bills we're officially supporting, I will discuss them.
Yeah, there you go. And that's why she's there you go. That's why she's a politics girl. All right. So on last year, we had these two individuals on. Don't get me to starting about dates because I have a lot of them in my head. But they came on and they were amazing, and they are back to talk about what they talk about. I might even get into it. I'm gonna let them take it. So I'm gonna let them introduce themselves, and from there, y'all know how we do it. We're gonna go. So which one of y'all want to start?
All right. I'm Robert Gaines. I'm the Director of Communications at the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education. My job is to be the chief storyteller for the organization, be sure that the work that we're doing and the efforts we're supporting are broadcast around the state and to our national partners as well.
I'm Dana Rickman. I'm Vice President of the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education, and I do all of the policy and research work.
Oh, the fun stuff.
All the fun, yeah.
All the fun stuff. Okay,
so I help produce the very dense book that you have in front of you.
Actually, this is, and for what this contains, this is a nice
and
little
share
package.
The title of it for folks who can't see it.
Yeah, the top 10 issues to watch in 2020. It's the top 10 issues in education going forth for the year 2020. And then Robert, as the actual storyteller, creates wonderful little one-page summaries of each of the 10.
Thank God.
Which we are grateful for.
For those who know, this is an 80-page report, so thank God for that nice little summary, which he sent me after the fact. But I'll get into that later.
They're also both doctors.
After the fact.
They're also both doctors, which I think we should share, and they did not share, which is very humble.
Yes, y'all should say that.
Yes.
Yeah,
we're doctors.
We're doctors.
In
my PhD is in political science.
Mine is in education policy.
So there you have it. All right, so let's start from the beginning. Tell us about the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education. What does it do? How was it formed? All that good stuff.
Well, we were created back in 1992 by a partnership between the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and the Georgia Economic Developers Association. And it was felt, frankly, at that time that the public education system was not doing a great job producing a highly qualified workforce. That the business community came together and said, we need better qualified workers. Okay. But the business community generally did not know how to engage, how to advocate, how to help, who to talk to bring those changes about. And so we were formed to be that business voice. Okay. And so our board, we're an independent nonprofit research think tank, and our board chair is always a business leader from Georgia. And so why I think we can all agree there's many, many reasons for a high-quality public education system. The Georgia Partnership tends to come at it from a workforce pipeline kind of issue.
That's good context.
Yeah, I mean, Dana pretty much covered it, but the objective is really to engage leaders across sectors to ensure that students have access to a high-quality education so that they can be productive citizens, but also be viable players in the workforce. I mean, if you can read and write and you're a critical thinker, you have a much better chance of being employed, right?
Definitely.
So that is our strategy to ensure that kids across the state, not just in Metro Atlanta, not just in the best schools, but in all schools, are being educated so that they can enter the workforce and take care of their families and be productive citizens.
And we really take it from an economic development standpoint. And so one of our sort of driving theories, philosophies, which I think is absolutely true, that investment in education is actually an economic development strategy.
Right.
So when we talk about, the economy of Georgia and, unemployment and opportunities for growth and all these other sorts of things, you can't not talk about education. And these kinds of investments are investments for economic growth. And so, and also when we talk about education, we're talking about early learning, almost prenatal, all the way through. We look at policies, post-secondary access, completion, that kind of stuff. So it's a pretty wide breadth.
Oh, this is a whole operation.
Prenatal, I didn't expect.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's where it all starts.
Can we start
Healthy
with the
mothers,
overview?
healthy births.
That's true. That's
All right,
true.
so how did we get to the top 10 report? How did we get there? Who decided that was a good idea? How did we get there?
This year's or just in general?
Just in general.
Dana?
We stole the idea from North Carolina, actually.
Well, at least you're honest about it.
This
Okay,
is-
that's common for Georgia,
This is
actually.
our 16th edition, so I'm guessing 17 years ago. It predated my time at the Georgia Partnership, but there was a like organization like ours that worked in North Carolina on state level policies, and they had a little, which you might appreciate more of a pamphlet of like the top 10 issues of the state. And we thought, hey, that's really interesting. And so we, the partnership took that on. And so for 16 years now, we've been publishing what we think are the top 10 issues. And we don't do it by ourselves.
Right.
We get together with all of our friends and neighbors and policy experts, everybody else around 1st of September of every year. And we look at the research and what's trending, what's happening. And we sort of talk through like, what do people need to know? And then we sort of, develop the list from there throughout the fall, and then it gets published 1st of January.
Yeah, right before the legislative session. So and we give it out to all the senators and representatives and get phone calls, folks who want to get it like weeks in advance. So there's always a little bit of fanfare around it coming out, and we've been fortunate to have 16 editions of the report.
Is that many?
Yeah, man.
I'm late to the game. I've only seen like, what, 2? I'm late to the game. I've only seen 2. All right, so let's get into the 2020 list. Let's give the overview first. So let's do the overview.
Well, for your listeners who I'm sure there are many that are steeped in all 16 editions of the top 10.
Absolutely. My astute. The Leadership Blend audience is astute.
Yeah. This particular issue is slightly different than the previous ones. Usually, though all issues are somewhat related, usually there's just sort of 10, discrete, here's what's going on in early learning, here's K-12, here's post-secondary. Okay. This year, in our planning meeting, it was brought to our attention some new research that was done by SREB, which is the Southern Regional Education Board. They had new economic research out that if Georgia does nothing different, looking at our population, but also our, like where the economy is growing through automation and, all these other like jobs of the future, Georgia doesn't change. We will have 1.5 million unemployable people in the state by 2030.
Seriously.
Wow.
And that's not unemployed. That's unemployable. Like
Will
they won't be
will
able
that still
to
be
have,
like 10% of the what percentage of the population?
Well, actually, that's terminology for people that don't know
Yeah.
what that means. What exactly does that mean?
What that means is for the available jobs that we will have in Georgia in 2030, 1.5 million eligible workers will not be able to fill those jobs because they don't have the skill set, they don't have the credentials, they don't have the degrees. And so we're looking at really an economic crisis. Georgia's been in a pretty good situation over the past several years. Our economy has been very robust. Our economy has been growing. That will not continue unless we really look at how we educate, credential, train. And when we say credentials in post-secondary, not just four-year colleges. Like we're talking about associate's degrees, nano degrees, certificates, all of these kinds of things. Georgia needs more of, and we need more of our population engaged in the economy. And so what we did for the top 10 this year, we still look at early learning all the way through post-secondary, but we asked the question for each of those issues, what do we need to be doing today to address some of our problems that we have right now, but to really, what kind of changes do we need to be making right now to prepare for 2030? So that actually does not become our reality in 2030. And so that's sort of the lens that each of these issues is looking at, how to answer that question to make sure that we don't have 1.5 million unemployable people.
So are these plans that we need to start today that would, if they run their course, we can kind of deter that? Or
some are things we need to do differently. Some are things that we're already doing that we need to sort of double down on, continue, things like that.
Okay, well that's dismal. That's dismal, but okay.
There's some good news.
Well, because it's right around the corner, 2030.
Yeah. I mean, 10 years is not far off, but I think the idea is to create a sense of urgency, right?
Yeah.
So if,
like we can't wait till 2028 to say,
No.
by the way.
No.
That wouldn't work. I don't think that would work.
it's a lot of people, 1.5 million.
That is a lot of people. Wow. I mean, you kind of see it now in certain sectors. It's like you see all these open positions. You're just like, okay, well, I know people are applying for these things. So what is the issue?
I'm qualified.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we do have currently a skills gap. I heard a statistic the other day, and I think it was something like 50% of new hires in Georgia are from out of state. We're importing talent. So while we are growing as an economy and we have new jobs, to be clear, we're growing in the metro Atlanta area almost, and there's some growth in other metros like around Savannah and Augusta, but generally it's metro Atlanta that's the growing portion of the state. There are portions of the state that are showing no growth and population loss.
Right.
And so, but most of these new jobs, or at least half of them, people are moving to Atlanta metro, but some Savannah, some Augusta, Macon, that it's not the folks that already live here that are being able to take advantage of these jobs. And so that's really the crux that we need to address. And it's only going to get worse if we don't change some stuff.
Is Alpharetta Atlanta Metro?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I was surprised that the first issue here was the first issue. I was very, very surprised because I've heard that conversation a lot. And
The
I know,
demographics?
but I was surprised that was number one. Does number one mean the biggest, the worst? The
No,
most
they're not rank ordered,
Okay.
but so they're not ordered in terms of priority, but
Okay.
in order to establish context for this is kind of a sequential nature. So the
Gotcha.
reason we start with early learning is it's foundational, right?
Gotcha.
And then if you look at the last issue, we're talking about post-secondary access and completion. Well, that would be the back end of the entire pipeline where you've got folks who are entering college, earning their credentials, and then entering the workforce. And so starting with what can we do with kids who are not in kindergarten, but are in preschool, early learning centers to ensure that they're getting access to quality educational opportunities. And then as you kind of just go through each issue, there's a lot of connectivity from one to the next, but it's not as though issue one is the most important.
Gotcha.
Equally critical, but starting with the youngest
Gotcha.
kids in the
Yeah,
pipeline.
and issue one, the preparing for 2030, shifting demographics and Georgia's future. You're right. We've been hearing a lot of discussion about the demographic shifts in Georgia. And so that one just really sets the context of why 2030 is such a problem and that why that 1.5 million may be unemployable. And so we do have, there's two different sort of demographic shifts going on.
Okay.
One is just the changing nature of our population, where our fastest growing populations over the past decade have been people in poverty, while we have sort of crested, and it's starting to come down a little bit, a percentage of families and children and entire communities living in poverty. You know, it's still in the mid-20% of our population is in poverty, which has all sorts of implications across all of these things. Also, with race and ethnicity, our under 5 population, we're already a majority minority population for our young kids. And so we are shifting to a much more diverse looking state. From an economic development standpoint, that's actually fantastic. There's research out there that says, the more diverse your workforce, the stronger it is and the more productive it's going to be. The key to that, though, is that diverse workforce has to be educated.
Right.
And then, so the other flip side of this conversation is that Georgia, like many other states, we're not alone here, has not done the greatest job of educating all students to the level that they need it to be.
Yep.
Which brings the other half of this equation is we don't have enough people with post-secondary.
Right.
There's not enough people in the state that have associate's degrees about 43% of our current adult population has anything beyond high school.
Is that out of 100%? Mm-hmm. Good grief.
Whereas 60% of the job postings require some sort of
At least
Right.
an
Right.
associate's
And
typically.
so
Right.
if we have entire counties in Georgia, especially in the rural area, where 25% of the adult population doesn't even have a high school diploma. I mean, we are grossly uneducated in terms of a population. And so that's the key number that has to really shift.
And the jobs are coming. I mean, the jobs are in Georgia, but people's ability to, to actually apply and do the
We're not
job.
going to do this. That's what we're not going to do. We're not going to let, what's your homeboy name?
Bezos or
yeah.
Zuckerberg.
Yeah, Zuckerberg.
Oh, okay.
She's an Amazon and Facebook girl. I guess my last good nerve.
But while we're talking about income, I do have this question, and I think maybe a fundamental question, because I've heard the statistics about the top quarter, the income earners, and the percentage who have a 4-year degree, and how that's doubled maybe over the last 40 years or so, and then the bottom quarter, and how that hasn't changed at all. So is it that income begets education, or does education beget income, or is it income first? Like, was it chicken or the egg? Like, just saying that we don't have an educated population, is that why we have a poor population, or do we have a poor population and that's why everyone's undereducated?
It's kind of like both ends.
It's a both and. What's happened in Georgia, and it's very true of most southern, actually I think all of the southern states, like their economic growth historically, especially over the past couple decades, has really been focused on low income, low skill labor. And so for a lot of decades, families and people were able to make sort of family supporting jobs, wages, without really high education. High school diploma could get you there, and you could support a family and you could support a community on that based on the jobs that were available. So Georgia, like southern states, very agrarian, very low skill,
right.
A lot of tax breaks, all that other kind of stuff. Our economy grew with that. What's happening now is with the shifting in the global marketplace, modernization, manufacturing, those jobs don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And so the jobs now that are available, you do need something beyond a high school diploma. And so we've created a low-income population based on the jobs that we built the economy on.
Gotcha.
But you do need now money to be successful educationally, right? I mean, the number one predictor of if you're going to graduate and go on and be successful is if you come from money, basically. Right? You're much more likely to be successful.
And there's a huge, I think it's 24 percentage point difference between low income and high income college students who actually graduate. So
gotcha, yeah.
If you come into college and your parents do well,
chances are already much higher.
Yeah, you've got safety nets around you. If you need a couple extra dollars just to finish, and we can talk about that a little bit later, you've got access to those funds. And so I think to your question,
you change your major a few times.
Right. You've got 6 years
you
to
can
figure
afford
it
to
out,
do it,
as opposed to maybe.
So we're really, you're right on. That's a great question though, because we're really dealing with a multi-generational problem. Mm-hmm. You have low-income parents and their low-income children, and these policies that we're talking about and the things we need to address, we have to address the situation of the adults and the situation of the kids at the same time. Otherwise, it's not gonna. And so we have, communities that are completely disinvested and multi-generations of poverty have now cycled through.
And I would assume that the importation of outside talent doesn't help either, because now it's going to move the standard because they come in with their own credentials and all that good stuff. So I'm sure that doesn't help either. This sucks. All right, y'all depressing me. Where's what?
But there's some things we can do.
Solutions.
Early learning. Issue 2, early learning. There's a lot of good news there.
Okay, well, good. We'll take that. So let's hear the good news.
Well, the good news is Georgia has been a leader nationwide in early learning. So you've got DECAL, which is Department of Early Care and Learning. Right from the start, Department of Early Care and Learning. It's one of the first in the country, right, as far as a dedicated entity for early learning. We're making a lot of progress on literacy. And DECAL received a grant, I think in 2015, or the DOE received a grant. It was like $51.7 million to invest in early learning to build infrastructure. Right. A lot of different initiatives in there, but essentially, Georgia's making a lot of progress. We've got Quality Rated, which is a standard for early learning centers. And so what we're seeing in the state is a lot of people being invested in ensuring that kids have access to quality early learning to build them up before they enter kindergarten. One of the challenges we're facing, not to go back to the challenges necessarily,
you
but
said good news.
No, it is good. It is good news. What we need to see is continued investment, continued access, because when you get south of Atlanta,
I was getting ready to say,
south of Macon,
this money distributed evenly though. Like if it goes to the right communities that really need it.
What was interesting about this Early Learning Challenge grant, and one of the reasons we wrote about it, is a 4-year federal grant that went to DECAL, and they set up sort of a part of it. They did a bunch of sort of structural changes at the state level and how they administer and support quality in early learning, but they set up like regional networks throughout the state. And so by region, they can look at how to, because access to early learning looks different in a rural community. Right. Mm-hmm. So what kind of services, maybe home visiting, maybe hub centers, sort of a spoken wheel kind of thing, versus saturating like the Atlanta market with early learning centers on every corner. I mean, so they really thought carefully about how would access and delivery of service look different in different types of communities, and really sought to put in a bunch of structures to support that. So now and then they also did early learning standards, a bunch of professional development for the teachers in the early learning space. But now that was all federal money, and that has ended.
Yeah, about that ended with last year.
Yeah, and so the challenge for Georgia going forward is we've made all of these investments. We've got some good strategic stuff in place. How do we sustain that? And then how do we also scale and grow that? Because there still is significant access problems to quality early care and everywhere, either the existence of it, because you have, rural counties have like one center, right?
Yeah.
And then for like those of us in a metro area, even those who are relatively well off, this
Being
stuff
able
is
to afford it,
expensive.
yeah.
Holy cow!
It's a mortgage.
And so and just access to quality and being able to pay for it and availability is still a challenge for everybody. And so we still need to do some work there.
Can I ask how other states kind of bridge the gap for rural and metro? Because I grew up in Oregon, and there is still, but maybe 2 metro areas in the way that I would consider an area to be metro. So how do other states handle that? Is it that those states are just okay to spend the tax money and we're not, and we're always looking to? Is that what it is? Does it come down to money? Does it only come down?
Well, I mean,
to
it's
money?
funny because you say we are trying to figure out how to sustain this, but then later on we have to talk about budget cuts. So it's
Right.
Right.
this is always
This conversation's not going to get better anytime soon. If you're looking for,
That's okay.
I mean,
Good morning.
It's a fair question, and so it's sort of a both and where. Other states like Georgia, and probably I think most larger states have this problem of like a metro center and then a lot of rural.
Right.
And so I don't think anyone's actually solved that. I think a lot of states really struggle with that. We have some of our, bluer states that do spend more money. But I think that access in general is something nobody's cracked that nut
Yeah,
yet.
I'm sure. Okay.
I don't see how much good news I got from that, but okay, it's a little something.
Really great things are happening in early learning.
Just got to keep them.
We just got to keep it going.
And scale them up.
Yeah.
So
Can't
that
find money for them.
Yeah.
yeah.
We have to cut from budget.
Yeah.
Is that a big part of the pitch, like proving it's working? Because another thing too that I'm sure is a struggle, because we want to focus on workforce and outcomes, is that, well, these kids haven't turned 18 yet or 25 yet. So it's like I've only had a couple of years, but then there's new elected officials. And so how do you get the numbers that you need to prove that what we did in 2016 worked, and now it's,
kind of like an investment.
Well, and that is something actually that DECAL's been working on. They've been doing some, not to get too wonky, but some longitudinal studies of the impact of the work that they've done. And as part of the Early Learning Challenge grant, they had a quality rated validation committee, and so they're putting a lot of research and a lot of focus into tracking what's working, where can they improve. We've seen big quality improvements over the past couple of years, especially in the infant toddler space. That has been one that struggles the most. They had the least amount of resources there, and they are now looking at how kids are doing in first, second, third grade that have gone through different right from the start programs. And so we're seeing some really great outcomes and some really great impacts. But the key to that, though, and I think it's a little unfair, like the Georgia Pre-K program is a really good program and has been evaluated, and the kids could go through it. It really helps them get ready for kindergarten. I remember, because it started in the mid-90s, so kids who went to Pre-K have now, the first round, have graduated high school. And someone was like, well, the graduation rate didn't change, because of that. I was like, well, they were in Pre-K 15 years ago, and things happened, in between.
It was a very long journey.
And so, there's a good effect, but you have to remember that it's like, if I eat spinach for a day, and then eat cake for a year, and then I didn't, so you just have to keep that in mind too, that, we are looking for breadth and stronger outcomes and kids that are more ready for their next step. But we have to make that next step rigorous and good quality as well. And Georgia's doing better in that area.
Okay.
And making improvements.
Okay.
No,
that's good to know.
It doesn't bring me joy, but okay. Issue 3. This is issue 3.
Literacy, the great equalizer. So,
oh God.
No, this is important. I want to talk about that.
yeah, I mean, there's
Jesus.
a lot packed into this, but essentially, what we know is literacy is the foundation for learning, right? And so, ensuring that, so Dana mentioned the 2-generation approach that we're seeing right now, ensuring that kids can read, but also that their parents can read. There's a stat here that says that low literacy children whose parents have low literacy levels have a 72% chance of reading at the lowest level themselves. So you talk about that generational effect, whether it be of having wealth or not having wealth, or being literate or not being literate. You have to create interventions that get at both, because if the parents are not in a position to support their kids, the kids are coming to school. Yeah,
the number one predictor of a kid's ability to read by 3rd grade is mother's education level. You dads are totally off the hook. It's all on mom. And so you can't
That
just
sounds like it's
focus
worth diving into.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of good news in here too. One of the things that Georgia has really focused on in the past decade is the Get Georgia Reading campaign.
Yep.
And really focusing on that, getting kids reading by the third grade. And there's a ton of work around there that the issue goes into. And a lot of work is being done around how do we do a better job of getting kids reading on grade level. And actually, the research has said that we look at now, if a kid is reading on grade level by third grade, the achievement gaps that we're so familiar with, of like what percentages people graduate high school by their race or income or whatever, achievement gaps are completely gone.
Really?
It does not matter your race, your income, if you're an English language learner, if you're a special needs student, if you're reading on grade level by third grade, you're just as likely to graduate high school as anybody else.
So then I want to ask about this, because the number one predictor, does that mean, okay, so in the opposite situation, like wherever the outliers are, the folks whose mothers are reading at a lower level, but for some reason are still making that grade by third grade, what are those, what are maybe some of those biggest indicators? Like, I guess in the opposite sense. So like,
and that goes to the supports that we're able to get at in terms of the things that like the Get Georgia Reading campaign are focused on. And so you've got the page opened here, like sort of the factors that affect the ability to read, right? And so the number one factor is going to be the mother's education level, but that's not the only determining factor. And there are certain things that you could do. And so things like, attendance, their child's mental health, the school climate, the access to early care and learning, out of school suspension issues, summer learning loss, all of these things, if you wrap a child in those services that we know work, can completely mediate the effects of the mother's education level. Problem is the mother's education level is so highly correlated with the family living in poverty and not having access to the services that we know work, like out of school supports, right? Extended instructional time, mental health, behavioral, socio-emotional kinds of things that we know are so important. And so those are where these things come together, and where the Get Georgia Reading campaign has done a great job at getting communities to really look at this as a community approach to make sure that all of those little kids have those access points. But another thing about this issue that I wanted to point out, again, the two generations, it's not just about helping to raise kids. The current workforce has problems in this because of our adult population. There's a very large number of adults in Georgia that are not what we would call literate. They can't read at anything beyond a fifth grade level. And so they can't themselves engage in the workforce. And so we know that low literacy in the workplace in Georgia, it costs us as a state $1.3 billion annually. And so we can't just focus on the kids in the pipeline. We need to really get back and look at adult education, look at retraining, getting adults to read and to be able to engage in a lot of these discussions, both for their own economic future and then their families and their communities as well.
So that means, given the third grade outlook, then that really falls down on pre-K. We really have to get them early to make sure they stay with their grade level. And
actually now research says you got to get them well before that. We talked about prenatal, right? Healthy births. It starts from there. And most of the big, again, really wonky, but from the brain development that we know, a majority of the synapses and the brain architecture happens are, growing like crazy in little kids from age 0 to 3. And so that's the real sweet spot of engagement. And again, the Get Georgia Reading campaign really talks a lot about what we call language nutrition. Our littlest kids, our 0 to 3 populations, are they in what we call language-rich environments? Is someone always talking to them, not giving them flashcards or trying to do the alphabet or anything, but just talking to them. And if they're cooing, is someone cooing back? Like that serve and return you talk about with kids, is that kind of what we call language nutrition. That goes a long way in just getting that brain architecture down in those first 3 years. Nutrition is incredibly important in that. So are the young babies getting what they need in terms of both physical, mental, social supports in that 0 to 3 years? Nothing to do with academic drilling. It's all about just loving environments where they feel engaged. That's a huge guard against a lot of
y'all got to put that on the billboard, because I don't think anybody realizes that those things are
but then when you watch these viral videos of these toddlers talking and saying things that people think are so funny, and they sound like
an adult.
Yes
I mean, you acquire
It's like,
language.
my God.
And that's how language acquisition happens, right? You hear it, you practice, you hear it, you practice, and then your kids are basically telling you what they're not going to do. Like, you know?
Well, you gas,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's funny. Like I've got two little ones, and we just my husband and I we just talk to them all the time. But that's just in our nature. And I've been steeped in this. I'm like, I know we need to be talking to my kid all the time. But they do start now. They're like 2.5. But my 2.5-year-old said the other day, she's like, I need to go outside for air. I'm hot. And off she went. And I was like, she must have heard that from somebody. Like, and so, but that's the kind of language that, you know, we have around our kids all the time.
Right.
And so it's not just, you know, sit. There's a lot of that, a lot of directional. Don't do that. Don't, and then just not pretending that they're there. Like just continually engaging with, even before the kids can speak. It does a huge amount of help there.
Yeah, that's why I was on the billboard. I don't think anybody. I mean, I played with kids, but I didn't think it was.
What about talking to kids like kids versus talking to kids like adults?
I prefer the latter. I don't know. I don't know exactly what the research says on the baby talk versus, you know, adult engagement. I did read an article, though. It was really interesting that said fathers advance their children's language development more rapidly because oftentimes the fathers are not at home. They're working. So they don't understand how the child may actually speak. And so they come home and they're just having a full-fledged conversation with the kid like he or she's an adult.
Gotcha.
And the kid just kind of picks up more quickly some of the more advanced linguistic
I can
skills.
believe that.
You know, I don't know about all the research behind it, but I thought it was fascinating. And in my own experience as a father, you know, I'm not there from 8 till 4 or 5. So I come home, I'm still in work mode. I'm talking to my kids like coworkers, you know, and they're looking at me. But then a week or two later, they're saying some of the same things that you've said, and you're thinking, huh, that kind of worked.
I can believe that.
Yeah.
And I don't think it has to be, especially for the really little ones. You said, "Oh, I didn't talk." Like I just kind of was playing. I think it's but it's just the eye contact and the interaction, and so it doesn't have to be a full-on conversation. Especially in the the 0 to 2, 3. They don't have a lot of language, but just sort of acknowledge. Like if they giggle, you giggle back. If they yell, you yell back. You know, that kind of
the validation that they're
that they're are doing silly faces or singing or reading or any kind of back and forth. They call it serve and return. That's just that sort of nutritionally rich environment of interaction where they feel happy and safe and loved. Like that's one of the big keys.
Here's the elephant in the room. Boys versus girls when it comes to that. Because there was...
That's like a fact, isn't it?
I'm not one to buy that. I don't care what nobody says. I'm not one to buy that. Did they do any research on that? Well, boys versus girls when it comes to that? But it was just like generalized.
I don't know.
But
I know that...
Good. So, I mean,
there is neuroscience.
It's a fact.
There's neuroscience on gender-based development, but I don't...
I'm sure there is. But then also all kids just develop differently. And what's normal for one kid is not normal for another kid. And some kids take longer, some are faster. And I think a lot of times we talk about these benchmarks that kids have to hit or you want them to hit. Generally speaking, that's true. But also learning is not linear. And so I think anyone with kids know, like it's not like, every month they've got another word or I mean, it's not like this step, but like they'll just shoot up and then they'll be flat for a long time and you kind of be like, dude. And then all of a sudden they've like gone. And so I think a lot of people mistake that too. That's
a good point.
And they do a lot of comparison too. Because Robert and I's kids, 3 of them are all within like 2 weeks. Yeah. And he came up one day, he was like, yeah, my kids counted 10. I was like, I'm like, how far? I'm like, Alexander, count to 10. And she's like, what peas? I'm like, no.
But on that same day, he'll bite half of a crayon off, right? Yeah. So
but then 3 months later, my kid was counting to 10. I was like, whew, we made it. But that's not a healthy, because it's not, it doesn't really help. Every kid's a little bit different.
Yeah, I could
it all balances
like a PTA.
Yeah. You can talk, but you eat crayons, so.
Yeah.
I guess you're about normal,
So can I ask, before we move on from early learning, would there be a miracle? There's so many policy implications for this, and I don't necessarily believe in this, but what if there was like a hired teacher to just live with families as they had a child, the moment they had a child, until that child was like 7?
There are
in France, right? They do that in France, don't
probably. I don't know. They do all that kind of stuff. There are actually programs, home visiting programs. One of them is called Parents as Teachers. These are all federally funded, but they are in the state. And one of the things that the grant did, it was figure out how to do some home visiting programs that were sort of center-based, and so you could get more people. But these nurse family partnership, parents as teachers, that they really do, and they targeted at low-income families, though I could have used someone living in my home helping me too. From the time the child is born, and really going over, just to talk to the kid, all of these other kinds of things, and help them track development and stuff. So that's an area it's highly effective. The research on it, I mean, the gains and the outcomes are incredibly impressive, but we need to fund it.
Gotcha.
And so I think I heard the other day, I think Parents as Teachers, or one of the bigger ones throughout the state, had about 2,000 families that were enrolled in it. And the demand is probably, 4 or 5 times that at least.
I'm sure.
So there are some really good programs that could be game changers like that are out there and available.
Yeah. Okay.
Teacher silent for that. Okay. All right. Issue number 4. Ripple effects. Oh God. And here's the fun part. Ripple effects of budget cuts. Okay. Who wants to delve into that one?
Well, I will say this one is called funding, and usually, again, for those of your listeners and viewers who have seen all 16, funding is usually one of the top issues for one reason or another. And the good news on this side is that over the past 2 years, Georgia has finally what we call fully funded our QBE formula, which is the basic formula that funds most of K-12 education. And so it's the state money that goes to the local districts. It's a significant percentage and so that formula is fully funded. QBE is protected from the budget cuts. So the main bulk of funding that basically pays teacher salaries and things like that, that is protected. Gotcha. And so we're very grateful to the governor for that. We're also grateful to the governor for his $3,000 raise he had last year for teachers. Yeah, so that was a big push. So that's all great.
And here we go on the other side of the mountain.
Outside of QBE funding, though, as we sort of mentioned earlier, there's a couple of reasons for this. Is that the current FY20, we're currently under the FY 2020 budget. Those run from July to June.
To June 30th.
Those have been cut by 4%. And then the FY21 budget, which they're getting ready to approve, that will take effect this summer, would be 6%. An additional 2 on top of the 4. And so from where we were at the beginning of 2020, we would be looking at an additional 6% for the 2021 budget. Okay. And there's a couple of reasons why we needed to do that as a state. One, our economic forecasts are not as robust as we thought they were going to be. And so when people did the original 2020 budgets that we are now cutting, the forecasts were just different. And so we needed like a 2.5% growth, and we got like a 1.5%. Also, when the state legislature had passed a round of tax cuts last year, thinking that the lost revenue from those state tax cuts were going to be offset by additional revenue that was going to come in from the federal tax reforms that happened. That didn't happen. And so they thought it was more of a revenue neutral kind of cut at the time, and it wasn't. And so we now have a shortfall of about $500 million from that. And so
pocket change, right?
Yeah, so that's the reason why we have to cut. I mean, we have, as state constitutional law, we have to have a balanced budget, and so the economy's not growing the way it was projected, and we have a revenue shortfall that we did not anticipate as a state. So that's why these things, need to be done. Having said that,
where is always the problem? Where are we cutting this 6% from? Is always the issue.
Right.
I think you might in particular. We just got our friends at GBPI, Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. They do budgets and taxes, and so I rely on their they did a breakdown that they just published the other day based on the budget proposals that are out. Now, none of this is final. They have to debate them in the legislature and approve it and whatever, but the current proposal, the biggest hit by far is going to come to the justice system.
Yeah.
That both the adult courts, juvenile justice, all that other kind of stuff, the biggest hit is going to be there. And so as advocates, we're concerned that a lot of the work that was done, especially in the juvenile justice reform work that had previously been done under deal, that may be in some trouble to maintain.
They said about $19 million, I think.
Yeah. Well, is that going to affect personnel, or how is that
it's going to affect GED offerings. So from an educational standpoint, some of the folks who are incarcerated won't have access to like the very thing that would probably prevent them from coming back. Recidivism rates are tied to.
Another one of my questions was the behavioral health and developmental. Does that have any overlap with education?
And we'll actually get to that in some of the other issues. But one of the things you were asking, like, what are the mediators of like parent education to get kids read on grade level? And a lot of the access to mental health, physical health, socio-emotional supports, all of that kind of stuff is very helpful in, getting kids where they need to be. And most of that is funded outside of the Georgia Department of Education. And so we're looking at currently in the proposal, $33 million reduced funding for Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, $12 million from child adolescent mental health. And so we talk a lot about, school safety and all these other, mental health, suicide prevention, all of these kinds of things, which are big problems in Georgia. They're losing a lot. $5 million for adult addictive diseases. And so you have parents who are, are addicts or have drug abuse problems. We have the growing opioid problem, things of that nature. Also, $4.3 million in cuts to the Department of Community Health, which is incredibly important for communities in terms of maintaining a lot of this stuff. $7.3 million to reduce grant funding to county boards of health, $6.2 million cuts to the Department of Public Health. And so all of these have their own sort of outside of education services, but will have huge impacts on early learning all the way through post-secondary education in our workforce. And so we have a lot of concerns about these cuts and are concerned that it's going to step Georgia back quite a bit.
Do either of you spend time at the Capitol to lay all this out? I mean, last week I know they started talking with the budget, but is that like a regular part of your thing, like during the session?
We do. We're actually going to be there Thursday for the joint House and Senate Education Committee meetings. They've actually asked us to come and present the top 10 to them and talk through a lot of these issues. More specific to education and some of the cuts, things like, curriculum development. We're looking at over $200,000 cut to curricular development at the state level, to support, quality curriculums. One thing that has me concerned, or an additional thing, CTAE, which is the college technical agricultural, the career, the skills track, right? The DOE gives out grants to schools to help buy lab equipment and whatever they would need for the CTAE, that they're looking at an $80,000 reduction for 2020, and they're going to zero that grant out, $2 million reduction for 2021. So any of the high schools that were using these grants to support their programs.
I would think that'd be so on agenda for this administration.
That's what we were saying, that we need to have a rise in vocational education and stuff of that magnitude. And
I thought that's what everybody was saying.
I thought it was at the top of the list, actually.
Yeah, there's other funding for it, like Perkins Grant and all these other kinds of things. But these are specific grants that the schools can apply for and say, hey, we need new, microscope, car lab, whatever they use to support these programs. I think it's short-sighted.
Very. We seem to do that a lot, Ronnie. I thought we do a lot of knee-jerk things, and then a year passed. He was like, that might not have been the best idea. You think? We just squandered away $20 million on... You have on new shoes. I don't know.
How much do we spend? Right.
It's frustrating.
How much do we spend on students? Or where does Georgia rank in terms of how much we spend on each student?
We're in the middle of the pack.
Really?
Yeah. We're in the mid-30s.
That might be the most impressive statistic I've ever. And then we were at the bottom of the pack.
Wow. We're at the middle bottom. It's not we're
like 35.
Yeah, we're somewhere in the upper
30s, but we should be proud.
Yeah. We're not in the 40s, but I want to say it's like, depending on how you measure it, but it's like 36, 37. If you just look at state funding. Of course, for local schools, if people follow this, state funding is going to be about, at this point, half of the money that's going to be going into your system. A significant portion are your local tax dollars. So you have local funding that you sort of matches that.
Is that normal? Is that low? Is that high?
That's pretty. I think that's pretty. I think, again, we're in the middle of the pack there, too. In terms of, but what's interesting on the funding part, and we keep an eye on time, make sure we're not talking too much. I always thought that Georgia, when they look at we talk about equity, like equitable funding, that from a state formula perspective. Because we also have, in addition to the formula, a different kind of equalization and sparsity grants where districts can get some extra state money to account for a lot of stuff. Compared to other states, Georgia does pretty well in terms of equity, meaning that from a state funding formula, a low-income kid gets about the same amount of money as a high-income kid. There are states that high-income kids get $3,000 to $4,000 per kid more than low-income kids. And so relative to other states, equity, we do okay. Our problem is these same studies will look at that overall, it's a relatively low amount that the state gives. And so you could sort of interpret that as we sort of equitably underfund everybody. And then that's where our equity problems actually come in, because then you have wealthier districts that are able to make up for that. And so they're able to use local funds to provide all these other things that we all want for our kids. AP courses, after school, whatever. Whereas low-income districts can't make up that difference.
Gotcha.
And so there's a bunch of, school funding is very complicated, but there's a bunch of different stuff going on with that.
And a lot of the rural districts with lower tax values tax themselves higher just to get their
But there's no value there, so they're very high taxes, but it's not generating a lot of money.
They're still not getting the money they need to perform at the same level. So it's a crazy
There's some
cycle.
structural problems there.
Things that people do.
Wasn't the solution to all that a little while ago just choice, like a choice from Dalton to Alfred? Like, I don't know how many choices you have, to be honest. But I used to hear that word a lot. And I don't feel like, I don't know if that's still everybody's solution to...
They are very popular solutions. And choice could mean anything from charter schools, which, depending on the charter, can have a great record. Like, we actually like charter schools that do very well. The new frontier, which was in last year's issue, are vouchers and education savings accounts, which we're a little more suspect of in terms of taking money out of the public realm, taking tax dollars. Taking tax dollars and using them for private, unaccountable kinds of things. But even in the choice market, that's only a good, even if it's the perfect policy and has great outcomes, that's only going to be helpful to urban and metro suburban kids. I mean, you're in rural Georgia, there's nowhere else to go. Like, I mean, so it's not a statewide
solution.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to issue 5. Issue 5 was the one I was shocked by. And that is the principal leadership insulating the teacher pipeline. I was shocked by this one.
Why were you shocked, Ricardo?
Because honestly, when we have these conversations about education, it's always about the teachers.
Right.
Nobody really accounts for principals because nobody really thinks about them. Just like your child directly sees a teacher every day. Right. They see the principal only if they're bad or in passing if they're out in front getting them off the bus. Yeah. So to see that that's an issue, I was surprised by that.
Well, teachers are the number one influencer of student performance. So that's why you were definitely on the right track. Second to the teacher is the principal. So the principal's job is to create the conditions in the school for teachers to thrive so that the students do well. But oftentimes what happens is, whether it be a district level issue that's affecting the principal's ability to do their job, or just a principal's capacity, whether it be training to actually be the principal instructional leader, all right, in the school, it doesn't always play out the way it's supposed to. And so one of the things that is a nationwide challenge is getting folks trained up and ready to be principals. There was a study a couple years ago, I think, from the Wallace Foundation that was talking about how the principalship in and of itself was becoming a less desirable job. It's a very thankless job. It's a very difficult 24/7, you're always on kind of job.
Burnout's very high.
Burnout is very high. So if you look at the turnover rate, 23% annual turnover rate of principals in schools that have high levels of poverty. And it's a similar statistic for schools that are high minority. And there's oftentimes a correlation, right? High minority schools are oftentimes high poverty schools. And the stress that comes along with that pushes principals out the door. So, how as a state, how do we account for that?
I used to see my principal all the time.
Did you?
Oh, yeah.
I had 2 or 3, I think, in high school.
She was a saint.
Well, I just thought about. I think one of my cousin's wife has just become a principal, and her biggest gripe is how much her hands are tied. She just can't She can't get a lot of things done like she would like.
And
to.
so it's the how do we equip them to do what they need to do, but how do we give them the training to know what it is they need to do? Because it kind of gratifies me that you're like, I was shocked, I didn't know it was an issue, that the state leaders spend a lot of time and a lot of discussion on teacher recruitment, retention, as they should. I mean, that's an issue, but nobody is really thinking about, you get that perfect teacher and you get him or her in a classroom. If they're in a school that is in chaos and they don't have a principal that can manage all of that, they're not going to stay.
Nope.
And so in terms of teacher retention and development, you've got to have a good learning climate. You have to have a principal that can sort of protect them from all the noise, but promote them where they need, like all of these things. It's so critical to have that school leader who sets that learning culture where students are engaged, teachers feel supported. Because you can have all the high quality teachers you want, but if they don't want to be in that school, they're not going to stay.
Can you give more concrete examples though? Because I'm just ignorant. I don't know what a great principal would do for teachers or what difference they would make.
Well, what's funny, and I think we wrote about this a year or two ago, is along the teacher continuum, they are creating these new credentials called teacher leadership, where teachers can take on more responsibilities and be mentor teachers, instructional coaches, and be the teacher leader in the building. And so teachers were very excited because they could have a career ladder, but still stay in the classroom. Right? You didn't have to leave the classroom to get more challenging kind of work. Then the problem that they saw is that the principal in the building had no idea what to do with teacher leaders. Because they didn't know about this new certificate thing or whatever. And so as a principal maybe who had been there for a while, if I've got a problem, I'm like, oh, Robert and I go way back. I'm just going to have Robert, my third grade teacher, he's going to go take care of that. Meanwhile, I have this great trained teacher leader that I don't know, you're new, I don't know you very well. I'm not going to take advantage of your skills. And so you're going to go find someone who does. And so it's that kind of thing to really understand how to... or to encourage teachers to be sort of innovative and maybe not worry so much about, assessments or accountability. You sort of take that heat off the teachers and let them flourish. Because I think teachers are afraid sometimes to try something new and different because they know that the assessments are coming and their teacher evaluations. Like, how do you balance all of that?
So I guess that's a question because there's so many conferences so that teachers are required to attend. Is that the same for principals? That they have conferences that they have to attend to heighten their skill sets?
No, I think there's professional development that they have to have, that's required for them to keep their license. And so, working with teachers on, what's the right professional development for you?
It's like any marketplace, right? You got quality, you got so finding the right fit.
Do they get paid a lot more?
Principals?
I don't know about a lot.
They get paid.
Principals can do pretty well.
Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it has to do with...
That would upset me.
That
would
definitely upset me.
It depends on the district. Yeah. It depends on... it depends. More than teachers.
Yeah.
That would upset me. I'd imagine as a teacher.
Okay, well, you don't go into like education between K through 12 for the money anyway. So I mean, that's never been a thing. So I don't know why you'd be annoyed about it. Everybody knows that teachers get into the teaching profession because you love kids and have
but so what do principals get into it for?
Well, principals oftentimes used to be teachers.
Well, that's that. Well, that's
and
but
they,
if that was
they get pulled out of the classroom to be administrators, and the skill set is not always transferable.
I believe
Hence, some of the challenges principals face in leading schools. To Dana's point, the burnout and the teacher disconnect. It's like, you used to be my colleague. You were a great teacher, but your principal leadership skill set maybe needs
and just setting the culture for
it's hard work
for the school. I mean, all of us have worked in organizations where the boss did not set a fun culture,
and that so is kind of a cross-sector issue.
You didn't want to go to work every day. If it was whereas Robert and I are fortunate to have a boss now that we have a wonderful culture, so we love going to work every day.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's same with adults. You don't want to go to a place
with a lot of sectors. The idea is that if you're great at this, you should be managing people doing that, and
all right, I'm going to skip around because we're running. So let's go to...
We talk about our kids too much.
Oh my God. No, it's fine.
Employment. I know you're going to talk about employment.
Well, we can do two more. So let's do issue number 8, which is rural poverty endangering opportunity.
Yep.
Let's go there. So what is that exactly?
Man,
you gotta breathe. Oh God!
No,
did I pick the wrong one?
No. That just kind of sums it up. Rural poverty is endangering opportunity. Rural is very popular right now. There's a ton of study committees and commissions, and what are we going to do about rural? As we kicked off the show talking about all the economic growth in Georgia is really concentrated in a couple of areas, none of which is in rural. And so it used to be, so goes Atlanta, so goes the state in terms of economic growth. Well, Atlanta, I think, we're all now stuck in traffic. We're growing as much as we can.
Literally.
And so we're getting to a tipping point where if we don't start to engage our rural communities in our economy, the state will tip, and we're not going to be able to continue to grow.
Gotcha.
And so how do we jumpstart these rural communities and get them back in, the economic growth mode, because they're not there now.
The industries are leaving. Access to healthcare is limited.
Internet's limited.
Yeah, very limited.
I mean, like, you keep hearing about broadband. And as a person who's been in the metro area my whole life, I'm like, what do you mean you don't have internet? Like, there are just pockets of the state where internet access is limited if available at all.
Yeah.
Right.
What is 5G?
And so what's interesting from the educational standpoint is that when you look at the data, the kids in the K-12 system in rural, their data looks like, their NAEP scores are about average to everybody else's. They're graduating high school. Their high school graduation rate is on the state average.
Yep.
But then they just don't go on to post-secondary. They just sort of disappear. And so the question is, do they not want to? Is it a culture thing? Do they not want to? Do they just going to go and work on the farm like their parents did? That kind of thing. Is it an access issue? The closest TCSG is an hour away, and that's a 2-hour drive every day just for classes. Financially, can they get there? Are they actually academically prepared, even though they've graduated high school?
Right.
They didn't have access to the AP and the IB and everything else that the more urban kids have. And so it's a combination of these things. Like, how do we get that group of students involved in post-secondary? How do we connect with them?
Or are they moving? Like going to...
Well, I think the ones that can access that then just leave.
And they don't come back.
Mm-hmm.
So you got a brain drain effect in a lot of communities where the top students do leave.
Yeah, they're going to...
But there's no industry to come back to. There are no jobs to really come back to. So
they're staying, they're graduating someplace else and staying.
Right.
They're going someplace higher.
Right.
So it's, again, kind of like your chicken and egg from earlier, which is like, how do you get industry to come if it doesn't have a strong education? But how do you get strong education if you don't have business there? It's just kind of so there's a bunch of stuff going on, but it to try and solve this problem, but it's very diffuse. And so we really talk in this issue about how do we bring all of these different efforts together to really kind of leverage a more thoughtful, coordinated strategy. And a lot of these economic development engagements, they're not talking about education very much, which concerns us.
Okay. All right. So we have time for one more. So y'all pick the last one.
I only do post-secondary.
Yeah.
Actually, 9 and 10 kind of go together, where the school to work pathway to employment is how do you get from the K-12 system into a post-secondary system. And so we look at things like dual enrollment. There's a lot of changes to dual enrollment right now, which is very critical to some of this rural access work. And then the issue 10, beyond the diploma, keys to post-secondary success. How do we get more people getting diplomas, essentially? Yeah,
it's one of my favorites. Mainly because there's really cool research looking at how traditionally underserved students are now starting to graduate at different rates. So like Georgia State, for instance, is a shining example across the nation of an institution that is taking students who have historically not gotten all the way through, and they're getting them through in record numbers. And so you look at some of their initiatives like last mile grants, which essentially are giving students the last little bit of money they need to graduate.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
Like if you're a senior and you need $50 to graduate, there's no reason why you should drop out.
I needed $1,500 to graduate.
Yeah,
exactly.
And they decided they'll cover that, right? And they don't have to pay it back. And
exactly. They've got a pot of money designated for students who just need a little bit of help to get out the door. And on the front end, you've got things called momentum years, which they're creating just a suite of services to really support you in that initial year. If you're a first generation college student,
then you're at a loss.
You just don't know how everything works, right? And so they're basically wrapping you with a nurturing system to get you ready for what's going to happen, and it's working. So when you talk about kids who enter college and are ostensibly ready academically, but don't have the funds or don't have maybe the capital, social capital, to know how to navigate, they're helping with that, and they're seeing a lot of progress. And
sort of final thought on this, too, is that I think from a entire education system, but certainly our post-secondary, either our technical college or our four-year degree, we need to rethink how Georgia does education.
Right.
Traditionally it used to be, just get that high school diploma and you're good to go. And then, get your post-secondary degree. See ya, never, get your job, you're fine. But the way that our industries are changing so fast, we really need to think about how do we service lifelong learners? Like, how do we get our first degree, get our job? That industry has changed. I got to go back and reskill and get that next job. And so are we doing stackable credentials? Or, how often do we need to go back and reskill, retrain, and remove the stigma about having to do that too?
Right.
It's just kind of like, okay, well, here's my next opportunity and here's the resources and the access to do that. And that's just how we educate and live our lives and engage in the economy. And so we really need to start shifting how we service adults, lifelong learners, continuous learning, all of these kinds of things.
Any thoughts, Dr. Gaines?
Yeah, because we're out of time.
I'm encouraged, man. Every year we do this report, we do start off with some of the things that make you cringe and say, oh. But
that budget one,
But honestly, there's some stats we didn't get to, but Georgia has made progress, is continuing to make progress, and we've got a great blueprint in front of us, which we created. I won't go into it because we don't have the time, but we have a roadmap forward. And I think as long as we have folks who are in positions of power to commit to doing the work that needs to be done and put the dollars behind it, we'll be in good shape. Those are my last thoughts.
All right, so this is one of the few times I do wish we had 2 hours, but it's fine. That just means we're going to do what I did with Dr. Kevin James. So this is part 1.
Yes.
And we're going to give it a couple of months. Okay. And then we're going to do a part 2 to see the progress.
We can come back after they actually pass the budget and we can see what's really in it. Because there's a lot of state leaders that really weren't excited about the first draft. And so I think we will see a lot of changes. I don't think it's going to pass in its current form.
I hope not, because we're going to be in trouble if it does. All right, so everybody, there you go. We're going to have them come back after the budget is decided, and we're going to pick it apart and really get into it. So I want to thank my guests on today, Dr. Gaines and Dr. Rickman, for coming back once again.
Thank you.
I adore you guys. Thank you for reaching out. And we will hold our breath until part 2. So everybody stick around. We have another segment on the Leadership Blend with your host, Ricardo D. Rice.
You're listening to the Leadership Blend podcast.
I'm ready.
On the Thinking Out Loud Network. Check out the Thinking Out Loud Network at thinkingoutloudnetwork.com.